Your quest for the truth. I hope you're all of a mindset that you want to learn, but most people resist learning. And the reason they resist learning is because learning requires change. And most people resist change. And so if we learn and don't ever apply any of the things we decide, the downfall of Jerusalem, King Zedekiah was his son-in-law and even threw him in jail in the dungeon because of his preaching of doom. And I'd like to start by reading from Jeremiah. And I'm reading from chapter 3, starting at verse 14. Turn, O backsliding children. The word backsliding means having turned away from the law. So in other words, turn back to the law. Turn, O backsliding children, saith the Lord, for I am married unto you, and I will take you one of a city and two of a family, and I will bring you to Zion. Now this is a very important point. The people that he is talking to that are willing to come back to his law, he has a place he wants to take them to called Zion. And I will bring you to Zion. So here we begin to get the idea that Zion is a definite place. And I will give you pastors. Pastors meaning teachers. According to my heart, which shall feed you with knowledge and understanding. And it shall come to pass, when you be multiplied and increased in the land in those days, saith the Lord, they shall say no more. Now, Pastor Peters read this to you, but he didn't point out the double negative, and I would like to point out the double negative here to you. They will say no more. The ark of the covenant of the Lord, neither shall it come to mind, neither shall they remember it, neither shall they visit it, neither shall that be done anymore. Now, I get the feeling in reading this, we as Israel have forgotten the ark for many, many centuries. And what he's saying here is that though in the past it hasn't come to our mind, we haven't seen it, we couldn't visit it, he's saying now that the day will come that we can do that. Once he has gathered a people that he can call his own to this place called Zion. Now, when's this gathering going to take place? In that day, I'm reading from Isaiah 4, starting at verse 2. In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. Now remember, Isaiah 3 is where God is chastising them for their wickedness, and said that he's going to take the wicked men off to war and have them destroyed. Are we seeing more and more wars take place upon the face of the land? Are we going to see more and more destruction of life? I don't believe we have seen the tip of the iceberg yet. And it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion and he that remaineth in Jerusalem shall be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem. Now when the word Jerusalem comes up here, it doesn't always mean the capital of Palestine. You've got to remember that the Hebrew language has no proper names. Everything is a description. And the word Jerusalem signifies the dwelling place of God. And it's a description, not a proper name. And so sometimes he may be talking about the capital of Palestine, and other times he may be talking about where he's going to be dwelling. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and shall have purged the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning. And the Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion, and upon her assemblies, those that are gathered to Zion. A cloud and smoke by day, and a shining flaming fire by night. For upon all the glory shall be a defense. And there shall be a tabernacle, and a shadow in the day, time from the heat, and for a place of refuge, and for a covert from the storm and from rain. So this Zion is going to become a place of protection. To find out a little bit more about this Zion, I'd like to refer us to Psalms 125. They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever. Now I'm going to get into a scripture here that has long been pointed to by scholars and interpreted. And we're going to look at it probably a little different than they've looked at it. We're going to look at the 14th chapter of Zachariah. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh. Now the day of the Lord is a specific period of time referred to in Scripture. It's also called the great and dreaded day of the Lord, the terrible day of the Lord. It's that time referred to when destruction brought about by the God of heaven will be so much greater than anything man can conceive of that it'll pale the efforts of the most destructive of mankind. It's also referred to in Revelations as the three woes. It's referred to about 7 places in the book of Revelations. And it all takes place towards the end of the 6th seal, just before the beginning of the millennium. Everyone has looked forward to a millennium of peace. But before that happens, this great destruction has got to take place. These 3 great destructions have got to take place. Now, if we were to talk about the first great destruction, as it's talked about in the Bible, when the sun disappears and the moon turns to blood, and there's great earthquake and violence and so forth. And after that's all over and the dust settles, what happens next? What great event is supposed to happen next? 99% of Christianity will tell you that Christ comes in his glory. But that's a deception, because there are 2 more great destructions that have to come, very similar great destructions, before that happens. And we're going to tie this all in together with the book of Zachariah. For the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoils shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravaged, and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall be cut off from the cities. Has that happened? Yes, that's already happened in history. So is he talking here about a past event or a future event? I think in many scriptures we find places where they talk about past events and future events. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and towards the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountains shall move towards the north, and half towards the south. Now, is this a past event or a future event? About 17 years ago, I was driving into Springfield. I was out here visiting, looking around, contemplating moving to Missouri. I've been here for 15 years now. But as I was driving along, I was thinking about this, and I thought, is that a past event or is that a future event? And I began to analyze this passage a little more closely. Now, if it's a past event, I would want to look exactly where it tells me here, and I should be able to find a mountain divided east and west, shouldn't I? We have eyes to see and ears to hear, and God condemns us if we don't see and hear. So I analyzed this very carefully. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, comma, which is before Jerusalem on the east, comma. So is he talking about a hill, a mountain, east or west of Jerusalem? And let's put aside the names that are known in the area for now, and let's look at this strictly from what it says here. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, comma, which is before Jerusalem on the east, comma. Now, on the east is a participial phrase that would apply to Jerusalem, wouldn't it? It's within the same parentheses. So he's talking about Jerusalem on the east. So it must be to the west from Jerusalem. Fire alarm. We're getting fired up here. Okay, if you take from Jerusalem and you go directly west, you come right through this part of the country, don't you? All right. That brings us right across the mid part of the United States. As we come across the mid part of the United States, do we see a mountain divided east and west? I went to the library when I got to Springfield, and I went into the library, and I asked the nice young lady, I says, do you have a relief map of the United States? And she says, no, but I have a relief globe. I said, that'll do. So she got out the relief globe, and I looked at Jerusalem, and I come straight west, and lo and behold, there it stood out so distinctly. Is there any other mountain in the world divided east to west? So straight? Ocean-going vessels come up the Mississippi River into the Arkansas River and go clear through that gap to the Port of Colusa in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the farthest inland port that will take ocean-going vessels. And so this is split east to west. And the mountains are divided to the north and to the south. If I can get this thing to stand up straight there so you can all see it. Now, let's go on a little farther here. Yes, this is the Ozark Mountains of the United States. Now, this is really very interesting because the Ozark Mountains of the United States are the oldest known mountain range in the world. This has been well documented. If you go to Arkansas and you go to the Capitol building, you go in under the rotunda there and they have a video on Arkansas. You press the button and sit down, and the first thing they'll tell you is that the Ozark Mountains of the United States of Arkansas are the oldest known mountain range in the world. Now, if they are the oldest known mountain range in the world, that would make them the first mountain, wouldn't it? How do you say first mountain in Hebrew? Ararat. The word Ararat means the first mountain. Now there's Indian legends about these mountains that say that these mountains were once one great high mountain. That's interesting, isn't it? That these were once one great high mountain, and that it was the mountain where the ship came that brought the people and the animals. So, some very interesting things about these mountains that we need to remember. And they are the Ozark Mountains of the United States, the oldest known mountain range in the world. Starting at verse 5, "And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel." You shall flee. Can you see the valley? Is that a very great valley? Remember it said there'd be a very great valley? Is this a very great valley from here to here, from the Rockies to the Appalachians? Is that a very great valley? Happens to be the greatest valley in the world. Unquestionably. "And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains." Now, if you were going to flee to the mountain valley, you'd go jump in there, between the mountains. But this is the valley of the mountains. "And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel." A very key word. Azel is only used once in the scriptures, in that one place. And in that usage, it's a plural. In its singular form, it's spelled A-Z-E-L. This is A-Z-A-L. The singular form of it is A-Z-E-L. Now, in trying to find a definition of a word by going back through a concordance, we have one slight problem, and that is concordances are written by editors, and editors construe in light of their judgments, beliefs, and understanding. So editors change things. And so if we want to get a truly meaningful definition, we have to go back and try to find a primitive root definition. And so in my quest to find a primitive root definition of the word A-Z-A-L, I searched all the definitions I could of A-Z-E-L, and I finally found one that I think fits. And it's a rim where something joined. A rim where something joined. A rim where something joined. Same up here. Now, plate tectonists always try to fit all of the continents back around the North American continent, don't they? Whenever they try to fit the pieces of the world together, they try to fit it back about around the North American continent. From here west is all upthrust plates. From here east is all upthrust plates. From up in here north is upthrust plates. And of course down here we have the Gulf of Mexico. Well, there's a very important reason why they try to fit that back around the heartland of the United States, and that is because there's only one place on the whole world where the plates have never moved. And that's it, the heartland of the United States. From the Rockies to the Appalachians, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Rockies. The plates have never moved. Do you remember what I read to you a minute ago about Zion, Mount Zion? They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever. That's literal. The only part of the land that's never moved is that part of the land. Now, the great and dreaded day of the Lord talked about here, when the day of the Lord that cometh, are cataclysmic events that are supposed to happen before Christ returns in his glory. There was a writer named Volokovsky. They called him a catastrophist because he wrote about these kind of catastrophes, and there's 3 major catastrophes that are written in folklore and in history. And these 3 major catastrophes represent 3 cataclysmic events. Now, we've told in the Bible that Enoch and part of his people left. The Peleg and part of his people left. The earth was divided. And there was evidently a third body that left. Now, God talks about gathering his people from the 4 winds. 4 parts being gathered together again before Christ comes in his glory, the whole earth being gathered back together again. Now, let's look at the visual evidence of where these parts may have left from. Remember when we were kids and we blew up balloons, or bubbles, and these bubbles would float around, and then 2 of them would touch together. Boom! They were one bubble. The earth is like a bubble. It's weightless out in space. It has a molten core, and it's very possible for 2 pieces to come together and become one. Now, there was another catastrophist that challenged the idea that 2 parts could ever come together. And his challenge was based on the fact that the pull of gravity would be so great when these 2 bodies come together that there's no way 2 bodies could come together without completely destroying both bodies. Reader's Digest just recently wrote an article on the fact that the poles switched polarity, and that they know that there's been at least 3 times in history when these poles have switched polarity. At least 3 when these poles have switched polarity. If 2 bodies were going in the same orbit, one slightly overtaking the other, and they were coming together, have you ever played with magnets and you had a magnet and you pushed it together and it grabs real quick as the gravity pull, and then you switch it around so that the poles are reversed and you bring it together and they push away? Well, if 2 bodies were coming together and got close together and the gravitational magnetic pole switched, those 2 bodies could very easily mash together without destruction. Now, if you look at maps studying plate tectonics, and I didn't bring all the maps to do that because I didn't think we had the time to do it, but Greenland came out of the Hudson Bay area. Should be back in here. When Greenland's back in here, there's kind of an open area in here. There was a Norwegian seer, not of any particular faith, but he made a lot of prophecies about the United States relative to the Civil War and England being extracted from the United States and so forth. And all of his prophecies came true. And he said he saw some more things relative to the world and the United States in a future time, but he didn't know when. But he said it was at a time when the United States seemed to be in such confusion that there were 2 to 3 different groups claiming control of government. We haven't been there yet, have we? So this may be something in the future. And he said at that time he saw an earthquake that affected Greenland in a major way. Well, if Greenland pulled back in here, that would be an earthquake that would affect Greenland in a major way, I can assure you. And he said that earthquake caused such high tidal waves along the west coast of the European continent and the east coast of the North and South American continents, that the tidal waves went inland as much as 200 miles. That would be a big tidal wave. So there's an opening there. Now, this continent here should be over in here. This whole African continent should be over in here. Right over in this area. When you do that, you leave another big opening down in here. Well, it actually comes right around in here, I mean. There's an opening right in here then. And then you've got another opening right in there. So there's places that these three pieces could fit, and there is physical evidence that that has happened. That these mountains were pulled up when those parts were taken away. And don't the scriptures say the mountains will be pushed down and the valleys raised up? Now, how does this all relate to the Ark of the Covenant? We're going to turn now to the second book of Maccabee, chapter 2, verse 4. And I've copied the text that I'm reading here directly from the original, a copy of the original King James Version, because the original King James Version had all the Apocrypha books in it. It's been reprinted by Nelson. I think it's the 1611 edition of the King James Version of the Bible. In 1649, they took out 28 books called the Apocrypha books. And I'm going to start at verse 4. It was also contained in the same writing that the prophet, being warned of God, commanded the tabernacle and the ark to go with him. And he went forth into the mountains where Moses climbed up and saw the heritage of God. Now, when Moses climbed up on Nebo and was shown the heritage of God, the word shown there indicates that he was shown in vision. He didn't look out and see it, he was shown it in vision. And the heritage of God from Dan to Gilead, and one of the translations does say from Dan to Gilead, is described in the book of Ezekiel. And the center place is the New Jerusalem. In other words, the new dwelling place of God. And when Jeremiah came thither, he found a hollow cave, wherein he laid the tabernacle and the ark and the altar and the incense, and he stopped the door. And some of those that followed him came to mark the way, but they could not find it. Which when Jeremiah perceived, he blamed them, saying, As for that place, it shall be unknown until the time that God gathereth his people again. Has Israel been scattered for a long time? I'll say. And receiveth them unto mercy. Then shall the Lord show them these things, and the glory of the Lord shall appear, and the cloud also. Now remember, when they had the Ark of the Covenant in the wilderness, there was a cloud over it by day that appeared as a pillar of fire by night. And when God wanted them to move, he moved the cloud. They picked up the ark and followed it. When it stopped, they set it up again. Then shall the Lord show them these things, and the glory of the Lord shall appear, and the cloud also, as it was shown under Moses, and as when Solomon desired that the place might be honorably sanctified. So, This is very important. Now, years ago, before I came to Missouri, I had somebody tell me that they had heard that there were Indians in Arkansas called Ark-carrying Indians. That the Ark of the Covenant had been brought to this continent, and that there were Indians that had carried it. Well, I decided I wanted to find out as much as I could about that. So I went down to the University of Arkansas at Russellville, and I went to the archaeology department, and I says, can you tell me anything about Arkansas Indians? And the guy says, I don't know if there was any Indians ever called Arkansas Indians. Okay. I says, can you tell me anything about any tribes of Indians in Arkansas? He couldn't tell me anything about any single tribe of Indian in Arkansas. He says, why don't you go over and talk to so-and-so at the anthropology department? So I went to the anthropology department. They says, well, we don't know anything. Why don't you go to the library? Talk to so-and-so. I went to the library. They couldn't find a single book for me on Indians in Arkansas. In the library at the University of Arkansas at Russellville. The only thing I learned in 3 days of getting the runaround was that the name Arkansas, that the legislature had added the S to the word Arkansas sometime in the early 50s because they thought it sounded better. A silent S? Sounds like an Arkansas thing to me. But if you take the word Arkansas, A-R-K-A-N-S-A, and you separate it, we all know what the word ark means. A-N-S-A is a derivative from a French word that describes the device that they use for holding a gem. What it really, in the primitive root definition, means is handles all around. The ark was carried by handles that were all around it, didn't it? Well, time went on, and we started moving to Missouri, and my son wanted to make one trip here with me because he wanted to go to a bookstore to find a book about Missouri history that was out of print. So while we were there, I asked the attendant, I says, do you know of any books about Indians in Arkansas? He says, oh, I got something here I think you'd enjoy. And he took me back and handed me a book that was called Indians of the Ozark Plateau. Very interesting book. And it described the early occupants of the Ozark Plateau, clear back to the caveman, and then the more modern Indian, and talked about how certain tribes occupied it. And then when the white men started coming in to the East Coast, the Indians, almost all the Indians had wintering quarters along the oceans because the climate was milder and they could fish. And then they would go inland on their hunting trips through the summer and then come back to the ocean. But when the white men come in, they started pushing the Indians out, and almost every tribe moved across the Ozark Plateau and occupied part of it at times. But in the last chapter of this book, right close to the end of the book, I found an interesting passage there, a reference to a publication of the Arkansas Historical Association edited by John H. Reynolds, Secretary, 1908, Volume 2, page 462 to 67. The Arkansas Indians lived near the mouth of the Arkansas River. They were first mentioned in the account of discovery by Marquette and Juliet in 1673 and appeared on La Salle's map about 1683. In 1800, the three principal villages of Arkansas Indians, often called Quapaws, were located a few miles above Arkansas Post. Well, this is quite a discovery to me, and I began searching the word quapaw. They were also called quapaws. And it took me some time to find a primitive root definition of the name. And the word quapaw means to handle or carry. And so there is strong evidence that there are people still living on this continent that were the, you might say, offspring of those who carried the ark to its final hiding place. Now, in this area to the south of the split, there's the tallest mountain peak there is called Mount Magazine. Our present definition of the word magazine is a periodical with articles or a chamber for holding ammunition. But if you can get a primitive root definition, it says a secret warehouse of power and knowledge. Now you've got to realize that when the French came in, they spent 2 years with the Indians learning to communicate with them. And they didn't go map this country until they felt comfortable that the Indians could tell them what the different features were so that they could put the proper names on their map. And this word magazine was the French word for what the Indians told them that mountain was. Now, the town of Little Rock was founded by people who, hearing Indian legends, came looking for the great treasures that the Indians said were buried in those hills. Well, there were great treasures with the ark. The ark itself was made of gold, wasn't it? And there were emeralds, a certain amount of emeralds with it. There were other precious things. In fact, that's why Jeremiah was so anxious to get it out of Jerusalem. Now, if you'd like to trace the movement of the ark, and I would certainly suggest to every one of you that do this, I notice out in the bookstore here they have Al Capp's book on Jacob's Pillar Stone. That's a very good starting place, because that book will tell you about Jeremiah's migration from Jerusalem at the time of the captivity, or the time Jerusalem was destroyed. When Nebuchadnezzar came in and captured Jerusalem and took the king off the throne, he put Zedekiah in as an interim king while he took the 3 Hebrew children and the other bright young Israelitish men to Babylon to train them to be his leaders. That's the way they captured a nation. They took the brightest young men, took them to Babylon, wined them and dined them and taught them to be their leaders, and then took them back and made them leaders over their own people after they were convinced these people were loyal to Babylon. The 3 Hebrew children didn't acclimatize too well, though, but they certainly worked. The Babylonians certainly worked at trying to change them. But anyway, Jeremiah was the last prophet of Jerusalem. And Zedekiah, after Nebuchadnezzar left with the bright young men, decided to double-cross Nebuchadnezzar. And he went to Egypt and got Egypt, who was the second large world power of that day, and brought them to Jerusalem to defend Jerusalem against Nebuchadnezzar. Well, once they found out that Jerusalem was being defended by the Egyptians, they naturally had to come back and drive off the Egyptians. And they captured Zedekiah, and they captured his sons, and they beheaded his sons one at a time in front of him, and then they poked his eyes out and took him back to Babylon. Well, Jeremiah was Zedekiah's father-in-law. And Jeremiah took Teotepi, a daughter of Zedekiah, and her sister, and left for Egypt. Now the reason he went to Egypt is because Egypt had a very strong fortification that was supposed to be able to withstand a siege almost indefinitely. It had its own source of water. They had large stores of supplies. And he was afraid because of the value, because of the material value of the ark and the precious things that were with it. He was afraid that Nebuchadnezzar would come after him. And he stayed in Egypt for a year, and then he left Egypt. Now, there are those that believe the Ark of the Covenant is still in Egypt. In fact, Raiders of the Lost Ark is based on that story. Because after Jeremiah left Egypt, there was a sandstorm for 2 years that completely buried that fortification, and it's never been found since. And so people have believed that that's probably where the Ark of the Covenant was. Well, Jeremiah went on to Ireland. He stopped in Spain and left Tia-Tephi's sister there. He went to Ireland. Zedekiah was a direct descendant of David, and it was believed that Tia-Tephi had David's harp. And they believed that they had found the burial mounds of Tia-Tephi in Ireland. Tia-Tephi supposedly married the king of Ireland, who was a descendant of the son of Dan that had left Jerusalem years before. And Tia-Tephi's mound is believed to be in Ireland, but the Ireland government won't let anybody excavate it. But they did let them drill a hole into the mound